Hello students, how's it going? So, for all our last projects, we were going with strings, and we were doing a lot of stuff with strings. Well, now we're going to start using some numbers. So I'm just going to go and I'm just going to run this module here, and I'm just going to show you what the end result is. So this is an integer, this is a float, this is a string, this is an integer plus float, this is an integer plus string, and it doesn't work, so I comment it out. So, that's how that's going to wind up looking by the end of it. Let's go around and actually start making it. So, whoops, that is the wrong tab. This is the right tab. Here we go. So let me just shrink this in here so you can see it. So of course, obviously, it already has all this code in there, and it's using some integers as well. But let's actually go and make stuff. So once again, we're on JDoodle. We're in a Python 3 program. So I'm just going to print something out, and you should already know how to print stuff by now. I'm going to, print, and I'm just going to, new line, and I'll say this is an integer. Okay, so now if I execute it, oh look, it made myself a new line, and then there's an integer. So cool. So now we know how that works. So what is an integer? Well, we can simply print, and we can just, now here's the thing. We can print, 10 plus 10, we could do something like that, and it'll give us 20. Or, just to be on the safe side, we can always do int 10 to specify that it's an integer. And we can do the same thing here. We can also guarantee that we have ourselves an integer by making sure we put the word int and put whatever we have inside parentheses. And do the same thing, and it'll still give us 20. Now, why may I need to do int every now and then? Well, it might confuse itself every now and then if you meant integer, or if you meant float, or if you just want it to be a string. Because, in theory, I could type out, a sentence that says, the 10 rabbits went to the mall. I could do something like that. But as you see right now, my 10 is a different color than everything else. But if I put it inside quotes, then all of a sudden that 10 now is part of a string. So even though that 10 before was an integer, now with these quotation marks, it's now a string. The same key could mean different types of formats depending on how it's used. So you're just guaranteeing that it's an integer by putting that int inside the parenthesis and the parentheses around the numbers. So that's an integer. What is an integer? An integer is a whole number. Okay, so you're seeing this is, 10, 20, 30. It's using whole numbers here. So let me just simply copy and paste. But this time, instead of using an integer, I'm going to use a float. And I'm going to do the same thing, except this time, instead of doing int, I'm going to do float 10. And then, you know what, I'll just, make another, and I'll make another float 10. There we go. Oh, hold up, I should probably say this is integer 10 plus 10. This is a float 10, whoops, plus 10. So now we'll see a difference here between the integer and the float. And now you notice, float has a decimal point. So integers are for whole numbers. Floats can have decimal points. So if you're going to be using something that has a decimal point, you probably want to make it a float. Now, if the program is smart, it'll automatically realize, wait a minute, I need a decimal point here, and it will automatically convert that number into a float. But don't assume it's going to do that. Every now and then, you'll just have to hard code it and make sure that you understand what a float is. And, you know what, I'll just copy and I'll paste again. Because now, we're going to go and we're going to make a string. I thought we said we were done with strings. Oh, we're still using strings for these print statements, aren't we? So this is string 10 plus 10. So obviously, instead of doing a float, I'm going to want a str for string. And then, of course, I will do the same thing, str. And I'll hit execute. Now take a look at what happened right here. This is a string 10 plus 10. So it's not counting these two 10s as numbers. Even though they're still in the blue text, that means, you know, number or whatever. No. It's counting it as just a string. It's counting this as just a string because I specifically told it, I want a string. I want a string. And here's the thing. You can't necessarily add a string. Even though there's that add sign there, what it's doing is just going, okay, 10, that was one string. Then I'll put 10, there's the other string. So basically, look at it this way. If I were to say, how would you add, you know, guacamole plus potato? The end result it would give you would be guacamole potato. It can't necessarily add a P to a Q. Like, these things don't actually, you can't add like this O and suddenly it becomes a capital O. That's not how any of that works. You can't add words together. You could just combine them into one word, which is what it's doing. So think of it like this. When you make something a string, it's not reading this as a number 10. It's reading it as a word 10. So that's the difference between that and that. Now, you're probably going, okay, let's try to mix and match some of these things here. So what happens if I try to add a, this is a float 10 plus, I don't know, integer 10. So what happens if I make one a float and one an integer? What's going to happen if I do that? Well, let's hit execute and find out. Oh, look, it made it a float. One was float, one was integer, and our end result was a float. So it should, like I said, if it realizes it needs a float, it'll add a float in anyway. But, like I said before, don't get too confident in that because it might not work all the time. So now let's try an integer and a string, okay? Integer 10 plus string 10. So I'm just going to make one of these str, and I'm going to make the other one an int. So basically, I'm now trying to add words to numbers and use them in a math problem. And of course, it does not work. Unsupported types for plus, integer, and string. I cannot combine them. I can put a comma in between them. Oops, I can actually delete the plus sign when I use the comma. But of course, all that does is essentially go, here's the end of that, here's the start of this. I can't physically add them together because they're two different types. They're unsupported operates. I can't use an integer and a string. I can't say something along the lines of holy rusted metal Batman, and I can't add a 4 to that. It doesn't. The computer does not know. How does this 4 translate into anything in here? Is that the fourth letter, or in the phrase, or the fourth letter in the alphabet? Am I looking for a D? Okay, is that what I'm doing? No. Do I just change this one, or it doesn't understand how to do it? It cannot do that, which is essentially what I'm trying to do by combining an integer and a string. And the same thing would happen if it was a float and a string. If I were to make this a float and a string, execute, it doesn't work. It just will not work. So I'm just going to comment that out, and I'm going to even just give a little message saying, you know, it does not work, so I commented it out. You know, just something so that we know that, yes, we cannot make an integer and a string together. So, of course, I'll execute it. Now we won't get an error at the end. Yay, look, no error message. So, that's the first assignment for integers and numbers for you today. So when you're done with that, be sure to save it, export it. If you need to, there's these little dots down here, and we can just go into, saving, save as, all that sort of fun stuff. There's even a little how-to FAQ if you really want to go and look at it. And just upload it up through Moodle, and you have a great day. We'll be in the next video in a moment.